Good morning, YouTubers. This is Jason Dean. So it's a Tuesday around 10:30. So I hope everyone's doing good. So yeah, this is going to be the beginning of another series. I wasn't going to do it at first. I was kind of on the fence about it, but then I was like, you know what? It could be a fun thing, and I could rediscover certain films that I might have, had only seen once or twice, or maybe now that it's been quite a few years since I've seen some of these films, I could really enjoy them. And it's the season, and what I'm talking about is Halloween. I did a review yesterday, and I'm in the midst right now posting it. I did a post and a video of the 1978 classic from John Carpenter, and getting back, so I decided to do a whole like coverage. Do cover. I'm going to cover all of the films in the Halloween series, and that's a lot of movies. But it's it's the right season to do it, and why not? And a lot of those films I haven't seen in a long time. So, but the reason I was kind of on the fence about it was I've talked a lot about other show in other shows. I did a full series on the Friday the 13th franchise, and that overall is my favorite franchise. I feel like each movie is pretty great in its own right. I think that there were areas in that franchise where the filmmakers took some chances, took some crazy liberties with the Jason Voorhees character and also the storyline. I think they took some chances. They got to the point of where some of them are pretty ridiculous, but I always found them super entertaining. It's something I grew up on watching, and I kind of love all the movies that are tied to the entire franchise of Friday the 13th series, the whole series. Again, like I grew up watching it, and obviously, like I highlighted in that series of videos that I did, and that was a pretty long, intensive format or exploration of all these films, like revisiting them again. Uh, I obviously have about you know three or four, closer to three, that are like my favorite films that I feel like are really great, and kind of high level for what it was and what that franchise is. So I obviously have my favorites, but as a whole, I really, you know, that's that whole mythology of Friday the 13th and Camp Crystal Lake and Jason Voorhees. That whole thing is just so part of my DNA. It's just it's so and I've talked about nowadays in our in our modern times, franchises are a regular thing now with you know all of the superhero movies that have emerged over the last 10 years. That's probably the biggest franchise, especially with Marvel and DC. It's like a never ending. It can be to the point of where it's like maybe overkill, but generally when Friday 13th was made, and when Halloween was made back, Halloween was made in '78, and then uh, shortly after Friday 13th came after that. They're franchises. They did exist, but they were very. I feel like they were pretty rare in the movie industry, particularly in like the horror industry. Obviously, a lot of there's a series of various films that came out during that time. Horror exploitation movies that obviously had sequels. Like one in particular is Sleepaway Camp. Many sequels, but that came out after these two movies. So that was definitely very much inspired and part of the whole slasher horror exploitation kind of explosion. So it's it was a thing, but now it's pretty commonplace. I mean, you have like I said, the Marvel movies, you have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, the Halloween franchise, obviously, which I'll be talking about, and then also movies that are non-horror, say the Bourne Identity movies. That's a huge franchise. Getting back to horror, the Purge franchise, huge franchise, also one of my favorites. It's probably my favorite modern franchise as far as horror films go. Really consistent. And then there's the Saw franchise. There's the Human Centipede franchise. The obvious Star Wars franchise that's been going on for years and years. And so there's, it's pretty commonplace now. And so part of me is I'm a completionist. I like to try to follow through on certain things. Sometimes I'm kind of lazy and kind of a slacker, but on certain things, if I get really into it, I really, want to see it to the end, and I'm kind of a completionist this way. So then I had the idea of, okay, well, I did the Friday 13th franchise, and that was a lot of fun, and I have an interview scheduled for that with one of the actresses that's going to be coming up pretty soon, which I'm very excited about. That's going to be the very, the kind of the conclusion to that whole series. So I was like, why not do a Halloween franchise? Cover the entire mythology, all of the movies that's entailed, and then also some of the other movies that are not directly related to the franchise per se. They're maybe their own thing, like say, case in point, like the Rob Zombie movies. And then I was like, well, I don't know. I'm not as a whole. I'm not really a huge fan of the franchise itself. I'm not a really big fan. I remember the films being always pretty kind of boring and kind of lukewarm. I was never really excited. I was always the films in the Halloween franchise have always been obviously the first one, which I think is a masterpiece, '78, John Carpenter. Part two, which I'll be covering today, is one I've always liked, and I've grown to like that more. But my favorite, possibly my favorite in the franchise, or it's right up there with the original Halloween, is Halloween Part Three, Season of the Witch. I just love that movie to death, and I just feel like that movie is obviously a completely standalone kind of film, but they really had a unique idea and really took some creative chances with that film. And and it's definitely considered to be, I think, a classic amongst people who are into like the horror exploitation world, like as far as movies that came out in the '80s. And it's kind of regarded to be more in a film in that kind of genre. And and that comes with some tropes or stereotypes of films that are kind of considered to be the exploitation, that or that deserve that exploitation tag, such as like, the bad writing or writing that's not so great. The same thing with the acting and the editing, but it has like a grittiness to it and a passion behind it. And watching, and I'll be doing a full review on that movie. But watching that movie, I just finished watching it last night, and I was really amazed by how. And I've seen it, tons and tons of times, but I'm always amazed. Like watching it last night, I was really amazed at how actually it's a really well done movie. Like it really is a really innovative story. It's really interesting. The characters are great. It's a totally unique take on the whole kind of mythology, even though it's not really based off of the Michael Myers universe. It's there are shades of that in it, but it's very unique, and the the direction of the film was very unique, and I really feel like it's actually a high caliber film, even though it's kind of considered to be a B movie, horror exploitation movie. But I'll be getting into that when I talk about that film, which will be coming up after this one. So what I decided to do, thinking about those things, I was like, well, you know what? I'll just this it'll be a fun re-examination of a lot of these films, the later ones, the ones after Part Three, Season of the Witch, which some of those I've only seen maybe once or twice. Say compared to the Friday the 13th films, where there's every movie I've seen a bazillion times or whatnot. Um, but I decided why not? It's a season. I'll revisit all these movies and do reviews. Whether I could have this new experience around them, or it could remain the same kind of not so impressed. I might be disappointed all over again, but it'll be fun to explore those films again because with and then also when I did a show a while back on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I considered doing the same kind of thing. And I'm not really a big fan of that franchise. I've seen those films probably a little bit more often as far as the total franchise. And there's a lot of those films that I feel are really not very good. So I decided not to pursue that. But I really feel like as a whole, the franchise is kind of a mess. But obviously, there are certain films that I really, really love. But so today, this brings me to Halloween 2. So this film is like literally a direct sequel. This came out in 1981, so like about 4 years after the original. This one, which I think is an obvious uh, thing that you notice if you're a John Carpenter fan, he has a very particular style to the way he shoots a film and the way he like explains a story, and he's very much known for like the atmosphere that he creates. And he's worked on most of his films. Dean Cundy has done the cinematography, and Dean Cundy is like probably my favorite cinematographer in general, probably. But he's got a very specific kind of look, and he creates this really incredible, thick, dense kind of atmosphere, and he's worked pretty much on all of John Carpenter's films. And fortunately, he also did the cinematography for this film. But John Carpenter kind of passed up the idea and passed up the chance to direct the sequel. And it was directed by Rick Rosenthal, who made a series of other films that were okay or somewhat forgettable. But this movie ter- takes place the same night as Halloween, and it's a direct sequel to the first one, and it picks up, which I thought was cool. And again, I hadn't seen this in a while. It's been a few years, so I watched it again the other night, and I thought it was interesting how they literally take you from take you back to the last 10 or 15 minutes of the original in 78, and then it follows it through to where Jason Myers escapes, or Jason Myers, after he's shot by Dr. Loomis, he basically escapes and is loose in Haddonfield again. So the police are out, they're searching. Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laura Strode, is taken to the hospital. So she survives, and so the whole story is basically centered on Michael Myers being basically loose again and kind of on this rampage. And then he eventually goes to the hospital to find Laurie Strode and to try to kill her. And Donald Pleasance is hot on the trail, trying to find him, and he's also in cooperation with the police. They're searching all over the city. They have massive roadblocks, and they're out in full force. So the whole series of events follow directly after, uh, chronologically, of the first one. And and one of the things too, it's not directed by uh, by John Carpenter. I mean, you notice that right away. And Rick Rosenthal, it was like one of his first movies. But so it's obviously not as great. It's not as good. but it has Dean Cundy does the cinematography, and it's actually watching it again. It's actually a pretty good movie. There's some moments, particularly when Michael Myers gets into the hospital. There's some good moments of some real genuine suspense and very cool atmosphere that I really think is due to Dean Cundy's work as a cinematographer. But there's some really good tension. I forgot some of those moments when I watched the film a few years ago, and I was like, you know what, this is actually pretty good. It's pretty. I like that it's consistent in a way that it really does tie in with the original. It's obviously not as well executed. It's not. It's kind of not up to the par of that film, but I think it's still pretty solid. It's definitely worth. I have this copy of it, Halloween 2. I have this on Blu-ray. So you feel it feels like for the most part you're watching the continuation of the story in like real time. There are some things about it that are a little bit silly and ridiculous, but to the point of where it's a little bit to the well, it kind of takes you out of the movie. At least it kind of takes me out of the movie to the point of where I'm like, I don't really kind of checking out a little bit. But it pulls you back in. But I think there's some great moments, particularly around uh, the scenes where Michael Myers first kind of enters the hospital. And some of the kills are pretty good. And the atmosphere is pretty good. I was impressed by watching this film again because it had been, many years since I actually watched it again. I've seen it, lots of times, but watching it in context and watching it in succession of the previous movie, I think can kind of help with the cohesiveness. I think obviously with franchises that's a thing, but I think really good franchise movies. Obviously you need to, you're not gonna if a franchise, say, well, like for example, like the Purge movies, which I really love. It wouldn't really make sense if you're going to start with like part 4 or 5, and watch them not in succession. You know, you kind of have to know the mythology and where the storyline has started and kind of what the narrative is. But I think those films are so well done that you actually probably could do that. I think they're very much in a order of this continuation of the storyline, but I feel those movies are so well done that they're they could be viewed on out of chronological order, and you could still get something out of it and get a real general idea of what's going on. I have a feeling with the Halloween movies, not so much. I mean, same thing with this. Like if I watch this out of context, it's still good, but it would be a little bit messy to the point of trying to understand what the motivation is of Mike who of and trying to understand who Michael Myers is and why he's after her. But as a franchise, this is a pretty good follow up. I think it's pretty solid. It would have been interesting to see if John Carpenter had decided to direct this. I think it would have been better. But I feel like he had the intention of not really, wanting to make this into a franchise. But then the success of that film was huge with his partnership with Deborah Hill, who produced the film. That, the film was a phenomenon. And now, you know, John Carpenter, created this massive franchise, one of the biggest franchises in the history of cinema and horror. And so, he's made so much money off of this thing. It's just unbelievable. Where he's still creatively involved with all the films. He still scores all the films, which is, I think, pretty awesome. Even up to the last 3 movies he's done, he's scored all of those films. So he's been involved with them, and he gets a big paycheck every few years when these movies come out. So, but this will be the second video for today. So this is Halloween 2. If you get a chance, definitely check it out. I definitely recommend if you've never seen any of the Halloween movies. I think these are maybe not so strong to be their own standalone films, with the exception of Halloween 3, which is a totally onto itself. But any of the films that follow the storyline of Michael Myers, I would definitely recommend watching them in succession, or you would definitely have had to have seen the previous one for it to make any kind of sense. But this is Jason Dean, so thank you again, and if you get a chance, like and subscribe to my page, and we'll see you again very soon. Peace.